Hi everyone, what's the scoop? It's SMA Program Lifecycle Live Week 10, and I'm your host, Sophie Kimball. We've got an engaging discussion lined up for you today. Ajay Patel and Greg Treverton will be diving into the current conflict in Gaza. Let's hear what they have to say. Over to you, Ajay and Greg.
Well, today we're honored to have Greg Treverton. Greg is an executive advisor at SMA and a professor of the practice at USC Dornsife College. He was formerly the chair and the vice chair of the National Intelligence Council. Welcome, Greg. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, AJ.
Now, we recently published a short opinion piece you wrote named, I love the name, Non-Sense of the War in Gaza, non being in parentheses. And you started the article by quoting a poem from Auden, I believe.
Right.
It was quite an interesting reference. Now, in this very compact 622-word article, you cover a very broad swath of Near East geopolitics and history. And there's a lot to unpack in those 622 words. So I think before we actually ask the big question of the title of your article, I think let's give our audience perhaps an equally brief summary of the history of how we got here. You good for that, Greg?
Sounds good. Sounds very good.
Great. Now, as a reminder to our audience, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are two Palestinian territories. I think they were originally part of the Mandate Palestine that was in the first half of the of the 1900s, and they were captured by Israel during the Six-Day War in 1967. And Greg, please correct me as I try to give this brief part of the history, because you certainly know it much better than I do. Now, there are, I think, today over 5 million Palestinians combined living in these two territories. Now, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was founded in 1964. The purpose of liberating Palestine as an armed struggle. And as the PLO became, though, ineffective over the years as a governing institution, Hamas was formed. And I think about 1980, late 1980s, maybe 1987, and was backed by Iran since the 1990s, and essentially displaced the PLO as the governing authority in Gaza, I think by about 2007. Greg, you want to give us a little bit about kind of pivoting over to Lebanon? Because that certainly plays a key central role in this.
Absolutely, absolutely. As you said, the Palestinian Authority was located in Lebanon, and in 1982, Israel intervened to oust it. And then it was firmly under the control of Yasser Arafat. But as Israel withdrew, then the Shiites needed to do something. They were battling the Christian militias. So they formed, with Iranian support, what became Hezbollah. And we know that Hezbollah has become a pretty effective organization with a stockpile of missiles and drones and things that is really very extensive. They've been skirmishing with Israel for years, really since the beginning. There was at least one major conflict in 2006 when Israel intervened in Lebanon. This was after Hezbollah had captured 2 Israeli soldiers. It's also worth noting that while we tend to lump Hamas and Hezbollah together, they are not exactly friends. They fought on opposite sides during serious internal conflict. What they share is antipathy toward Israel and the sponsorship of Iran. It's probably also worth noting that Iran's control over these proxies, as they're always labeled in the press, is less than complete. We know that from our own experience with our allies and proxies, so that there is the possibility of somewhat independent action by those. It's not just a front that Iran can command.
Yeah, certainly not allies, as you pointed out, between Hamas and Hezbollah, but yet tied by some very strong common binds. Interesting enough, the Shiite insurgents in Lebanon that coalesced into Hezbollah, they fought. I mean, let's not forget, they fought a really brutal battle, war in Lebanon over control of Lebanon, and with many Americans killed and kidnapped. Everyone might recall the assault on the Marine barracks and also the bombing of the American embassy.
The civil war in Lebanon had begun in 1970 and went on and on and on, basically, until Israel intervened, and then Hezbollah got formed.
Yeah. Now, today, since the October 7th attacks, Hezbollah has shown, I guess, what might be best called as maybe tepid or moderate support. They certainly increased their firing of rockets into Israel, but still, I think, at a fairly low level of intensity, but sufficient to have displaced thousands of Israelis from the northern border area. The kibbutz is there.
Maybe
Uh,
100,000 or something like that, a big number. Yes.
yeah. Yeah. And so now in your article, you mentioned a couple of recent events, Israel taking out one of Hezbollah's commanders recently, though I think over the years, have probably taken out well over half of their commanders over time. Also, the recent barrage of missiles and drones against Israel and hundreds of missiles and drones. I don't know the specifics, but certainly interesting enough. Both the U.S. and Israel and Arab allies helped basically take them all out before they really caused any significant damage. And then, of course, the most recent event that your article, I think, was catalyzed by, which was the taking out the assassination of Hamas's leader, Ismail Haniyeh, in Tehran. Quite a bold move, and who unfortunately was succeeded by a really hardliner, the architect behind the October 7th attacks, Yahya Sinwar. So the big question on the table, Greg, is whether this was a surprising miscalculation by the Netanyahu government, or was it merely to remind the clerics in Iran of their vulnerability? Or really, is this perhaps some type of a catalyst for a decisive endgame by the Israeli government? So without making light of the situation, let me ask you, Greg, is this sense or is this nonsense?
Well, I think it's rather nonsense. We don't want to make light of it for sure. But it seems to me from the beginning, neither Iran nor Israel have had any interest in an expanded war in the Middle East. And therefore, I'm surprised that Israel in particular hasn't been more restrained. By my lights, Iran has been relatively restrained when, as you mentioned, the April attack on Israel, but they telegraphed it, said it was coming. And as you said, the coalition of Israel, the United States, and several Arab states managed to knock down virtually everything that was coming to them. So at that point, that looked more like a signal than a real attack. And therefore, for Israel to take out their negotiating partner and do it on Iranian soil, that does seem to me surprising, at least. And last thing I think you want to do is kill your negotiating partner, and doing it in Iran almost required that Iran do something. So if Israel is trying to keep the war contained, as it says it wants to crush Hamas in Gaza, I find that a strange technique. It seems like something that neither Mossad nor Shin Bet would be the two Israeli services, intelligence services, would do. So I do find this rather nonsense. And the other part is there really has never been on Israel's part any sense of what the end game is in Gaza. Yes, they want to crush Hamas. That's probably not possible. So then what? And what next? And this I think complicates that search for an end game, and certainly does make it harder to reach the kind of ceasefire that Israel especially wants. Hamas, I think, wants it in one sense, but in another sense, Hamas probably benefits from the continuing war. Continued war is good for it. That's why it did what it did in October, in any case, to start major war. So I find this puzzling, particularly on Israel's part.
So could it just be as simple as, for decades now, I think Israel has targeted basically through assassinations, key leaderships, particularly with Hezbollah, right? Over the years, many times unsuccessful, but sometimes successful. Could it just been that they saw this unique opportunity, albeit in Tehran, and took it as just part of that pattern of taking out key leaders over the years?
It could be. It could be. It would sort of operating by standard operating procedure. It doesn't seem particularly wise given the circumstances of this case. But it may well be that it was too tempting. They had them in their sights. They had the bomb laid, and therefore they just went ahead and did it. But it still seems to me surprising and not especially strategic given Israel's interests.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to have prompted anything, I think, particularly specific around Hezbollah's role as well. Or did I not catch something in the news?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, there was the Sunday suicide attack,
All right.
maybe suicide. We're not quite sure whether it's suicide or not in Tel Aviv. So there is some retaliation, but Iran has been very careful again to say over and over again that yes, it'll have to retaliate for the killing in Iran, but it's going to take time and it isn't going to rush it. Again, some restraint on Iran's part, which for me makes the Israeli action all the more surprising.
Hmm. You mentioned in your article, Greg, and I'll quote, so too, we've understood after more than a half a century that the Arab states will do anything for the Palestinians except help them. So, as you mentioned, it seems that the only interested party here in extending the war is Hamas. Do you think that statement of yours really is this kind of the overall moderating truth, perhaps that's existed now for decades that has kept that action from actually having escalated at least anything in the near term?
Well, it's certainly true that throughout the years, the Arab states have fought each other, but they've never really fought for the Palestinians. And indeed, certainly part of Hamas's brutal calculation before October had to be that the Palestinian issue was passing from the world stage, even in the Arab countries. So that sense, it was a kind of a desperate move to remind the world that the Palestinian problem was still alive and still there. But given the Abrahamic Accords between some of the Arab states and Israel, it looks like some solution for the Palestinians is really no closer than it ever was, and maybe somewhat further, since Israel has been busily building more settlements on the West Bank, even as it's involved in Gaza.
Do you think the successful assassination, perhaps in any way, actually deepened Israel's resolve in what they've been engaged in here now, and particularly with, I think, yesterday, the recovery of 6 dead bodies of hostages?
It probably has increased the resolve, certainly, of Netanyahu and his governing coalition. Obviously, there's lots of opposition in Israel, mostly by people who like to get the remaining hostages out, and that requires some agreement, some ceasefire, something like that. But it probably does, whether they intended it or not, harden the Israeli attitude toward going forward.
Do you feel that I believe that Israel now has basically controlled the southern part of the Gaza Strip, the part between Gaza and Egypt, and I think that they've stated that they're going to remain in control of that, and I think with the desire that the people will be displaced to the northern part of the Gaza Strip. Can you just comment a little bit on that and whether or not you think that you see that as perhaps that they will continue to occupy that and control that for the decades to come?
Yeah, that's certainly something Hamas has said. Well, this is a new demand, the occupation in the south, and then they're also talking about having lines sort of in the middle of Gaza to monitor the movement of Gazans back north. Both of those are Hamas says are unacceptable. So they do suggest, it seems to me, that there has been a hardening of the Israeli view, even as the idea of what's the end game still is very elusive. On the current track, it's almost looks like Israel will wind up occupying Hamas for a long time, which is certainly what they don't want to do. But that's kind of the track we're on, it seems to me.
And there's actually 2 end games here at play, I think. Certainly the one in Gaza, but also there's always been speculation about whether or not Israel would ever take a decisive move against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Do you want to comment a little bit about that? I think that's been speculation that's been around for quite some time.
Well, they've done it in the past. They maybe will do it again, right? They did it in 2006. So certainly they're likely to do it again. It depends, I think, on how much of a provocation Hezbollah offers. And it also depends a lot on what happens in Gaza itself, since in current circumstances, it does seem to me that Israel has really no incentive to widen the war. They may feel they need to do sort of tit-for-tat retaliations if Hezbollah attacks them. But beyond that, it seems to me their interest is in trying to focus on Gaza, get that done, and find some end game for it, and hope that then it can rebuild its relations, its burgeoning relations with some of the Arab states, which have been obviously a casualty of this war as well.
And then you did mention the Houthis in your article. Let's want to talk a little bit about that for our audience. That's kind of, I think, the third group that the Iranian clerics have, have backed.
Yes, they certainly back them, and they've done, they've interfered with shipping in that region. They're able to do that. There've been several sets of U.S. and British airstrikes on them in Yemen. So they are a nuisance, and they are again in that category of proxy, but how much control exactly Iran has, not so clear. They're certainly a major nuisance in this, and one of the good reasons to have some ceasefire would be that would then undercut the rationale not just of Hezbollah and Hamas, but also the Houthis for interfering with shipping in that part of the world.
So I know that you're not quick to give predictions. I don't think that's been in your nature for all the decades you've been in national security. So I won't ask you for a prediction, but I will ask you for some of your final thoughts about how you think this might eventually just end up getting resolved. What do you think is perhaps given the kind of the role's attention on this, as well as support from certainly the Americans and other countries on both sides. It's as well. There's countries supporting the Hamas and Hezbollah, not just Iran. What do you think? What do you think we can expect to see, at least in the coming years, on this?
Well, certainly the Biden administration has been rather bullish about the talks. Say they're close. Tony Blinken said the other day this is probably the best chance and maybe the last chance. It looks like to me what we'll end up with is a kind of raggedy ceasefire where there continues fighting, but there may be some agreements, maybe some hostages get released, maybe the better agreements on better provisions for feeding and taking care of the people in Gaza. But my sense is it's going to wind up being a pretty ragged, maybe a kind of what some people call a frozen conflict that doesn't really have a solution, but just is there and is hot sometimes and not so hot others. That's not a very optimistic prognosis, I know, but it does seem to me the track we're on.
Certainly, I guess it sounds like, if anything, nothing gained by anybody as a result, if that's where we end up.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. Even Hamas, it's probably this has been a good recruiting opportunity for Hamas, but it's made Hamas, which was never very popular in Gaza because it was lousy at governing the place.
Right.
It's probably even less popular, less likely that Gazans would want to have it as the government again.
I guess they've become just as unpopular as the PLO was when they became incredibly ineffective. It certainly has become an election issue, though, here in the States, hasn't it?
It has. It certainly has. It certainly has. And the longer it goes without a ceasefire, the more pressure, obviously, there is, particularly in the Democratic Party, to do something to mitigate the suffering in Gaza. It'll continue, I think, to grow in significance if and as the war continues.
Yeah, indeed. Greg, before we sign off, and we would love to have you back on again, do you have any final thoughts for our audience?
Well, I wish I had more optimistic things to say. I would hope that the ceasefire agreement will happen in some form, but it looks to me like for all the optimism, the sides are still pretty far apart. So that takes me back to thinking that any ceasefire will be kind of a raggedy, tacit one, not an explicit agreement between the parties.
Well, thank you, Greg. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, AJ and Greg, for those valuable insights. And look who just joined us. Welcome, Jacques. AJ and I are in the studio.
Yes. Well, thanks, Sophie. Yeah, it's been another really whirlwind week. AJ and I were in Morristown, New Jersey this week with Chuck Goddard, meeting with Lockheed executives. And we also went down to DC and had several meetings there. And that all happened within basically a one day period, right?
36 hours, I
Yeah,
think.
we were probably on the ground about 24 hours,
Yeah,
maybe, right?
that's right. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Lockheed Martin facility in Morristown, New Jersey, that's their main center for radars and ship combat systems. They dominate a good deal of that market.
Yeah, this was the original RCA site, one of the earliest developers of radars. And many of you may remember their Victrola record players from 1929.
Whoa, I think their logo looks exactly like Buddy.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
On the record players.
Yep, exactly.
Amazing. And now we can't forget about this week's Art Flash. Banksy is making waves across the UK with his latest art installations, all centered around animals. One standout piece and my personal favorite from this collection, shown here, features animals attempting to escape from the London Zoo. A powerful commentary on captivity and freedom that only Banksy could deliver. His unique blend of humor and social critique always captivates and challenges us, turning each piece into a conversation starter. It's fascinating to see how he continues to push the boundaries of street art, reminding us that art can be both playful and thought-provoking. Our producer actually had the opportunity to go see the elephants. How cool is that? Oh my gosh, amazing. And before we wrap up, I have to ask everyone, did anyone catch that blue moon on Monday night? It's the second full moon in August, which is what makes it a blue moon. And because it was so much closer to Earth, it appeared larger and brighter in the sky, a phenomenon called a supermoon. Some of our staff took these amazing photos of it, just in case you missed it. A big thanks to Jacques, Dick, James, Vivek, and Lucky for these stunning photos. It was a spectacular sight, and we won't see another supermoon until 2037. And let's not forget about the upcoming Paralympics starting Wednesday, August 28th. I can't wait. So that's the scoop. And this week's flavor is honeycomb. We'll see you all next week. Bye.